I called my ex's sister my wife at the diner, and the moment the word left my mouth, the whole table went silent. The fork stopped halfway to her lips, my daughter froze mid-bite, and the nosy old man who'd been telling her she was wasting her life on us just stared. I only said it to shut him up. I never planned to say wife. But then my ex's sister, Ivy, the woman who'd quietly held my broken family together since her sister died, turned the deepest shade of red I'd ever seen, laced her fingers through mine, and whispered 6 words that split my whole life into before and after. Don't you dare take it back. My name is Daniel. I'm 34, a widower raising a 5-year-old alone, and the woman across that diner booth was never supposed to be mine. She was my late wife's little sister. She moved into our guest room just for a few weeks and never left. She taught me how to be a father again when grief had hollowed me out. And somewhere in those 2 years, I fell in love with the one person I swore I'd never let myself want, and was too ashamed to say a single word. But now the word was out. Now the whole diner knew. So why didn't Ivy correct me? Why did she grip my hand like she'd been waiting years to hear it? And what happens when her parents, the parents who buried my wife, her sister, find out that the man who was supposed to be grieving just called their surviving daughter his wife, in front of half the town, over a plate of blueberry pancakes? Let me back up. Because none of this makes sense unless you understand what that booth used to be. Ruby's Diner sits on the corner of Main and Pine, 1 block from the hardware store, with a bell over the door that's been rusted the same shade of orange since before I was born. The floor is cracked red tile. The coffee is always a little too strong. And every Sunday morning for the last 2 years, without ever once deciding to, Ivy and I have carried my daughter Poppy through that door and slid into the same window booth like it was written somewhere that we had to. It started as grief. It became a habit, and on the morning everything changed. It was just supposed to be breakfast. Poppy was 6 that spring, all gap teeth and stubborn cowlicks, narrating an elaborate story about a caterpillar she'd found at daycare, while syrup ran down her chin faster than any napkin could catch it. Ivy was laughing, the real laugh, not the polite one, the one that used to belong to her sister and now, somehow, belonged to both of them. And I was watching her do it, the way I did most Sundays now, quietly, guiltily, like a man stealing warmth from a fire he had no right to sit beside. I want you to understand something about grief before I go any further, because if you've never lived inside it, the rest of this story won't make sense. Grief doesn't leave when the funeral ends. It moves in. It rearranges the furniture of your life, and then it just stays. Some mornings it's quiet, almost gentle, like a house guest who knows not to speak until spoken to. Other mornings it stands in the kitchen doorway and won't let you leave the house. For the first year after my wife Claire died, grief lived in every room of my house. It lived in the smell of her shampoo, still in the bathroom cabinet I couldn't throw away. It lived in the sound of Poppy asking every single night for months when Mommy was coming home from heaven. It lived in my hands, which forgot overnight how to braid hair or pack a lunch or do anything except grip the steering wheel too tight on the drive to daycare, blinking too fast, praying nobody would ask if I was okay because I did not have an honest answer. And then Ivy showed up. She came the week after the funeral with 2 suitcases and a face that looked exactly like her sister's, which was its own kind of quiet violence every time I looked at her, and she said, "I'm staying in the guest room, just until you're steady. Don't argue with me, Daniel. I already told my landlord." I should have said no. I think some part of me knew, even then, standing in my own doorway with a 3-year-old on my hip and a house full of grief, that letting Claire's little sister move into my home was going to change something in me I wasn't ready to look at. But I was drowning. And she was the only person who reached in without asking me to explain what it felt like to be underwater. She learned how Poppy liked her toast cut, corners off, cut into triangles, never squares. Don't ask why. Nobody knows why. She learned the exact rhythm of Poppy's bedtime stalling tactics, the 14-minute negotiation over one more song, one more hug, one more glass of water. She learned, faster than I ever could have taught her, how to build a home back up out of the wreckage of one that had just been demolished. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I couldn't tell you the week, I couldn't tell you the day, I stopped being grateful to her and started being something else entirely. Something I did not have permission to feel. Something that terrified me every single time I let myself notice it. Because how do you fall in love with your dead wife's sister without becoming the villain of your own story? That's the question that lived in my chest for 2 years. Silent. Unspoken. Growing heavier every single Sunday morning, we sat in that booth together like a family that had never technically been assembled on purpose. And that particular Sunday, it was Harold Pruitt who finally cracked the whole thing open. Harold had known Claire's family since she was in diapers. He was 71, retired from the mill, a permanent fixture on the third stool from the register. And he had the particular confidence of an old man who believed 30 years of local history gave him the right to say absolutely anything to anybody. He shuffled over to our booth with his coffee in hand, looked Ivy up and down the way you'd inspect a used car, and said, loud enough for 3 tables to hear it, Ivy Calder, pretty girl like you, still playing house with your sister's widower 2 years on. Somebody ought to tell you you're wasting your good years on another woman's family. I felt Ivy go still beside me. Not offended still. Something worse. The kind of still that comes from hearing, out loud, in public, the exact fear you've been carrying alone in silence for 2 years. Poppy, thank God, was too busy building a syrup lake to notice the temperature of the room had changed. But I noticed. I noticed the way Ivy's hand found her water glass and gripped it too hard. I noticed her jaw tighten, the way it does right before she cries and refuses to let herself. And something in me, something that had been building pressure for 2 solid years, just came loose. She's my wife, I said. The words weren't planned. I want to be honest with you about that, because everything that happened after depended on the fact that I did not sit down that morning intending to say them. They arrived the way a flood arrives, not gradually, but all at once, breaking through something that had been straining against the weight of it for a very long time. Harold blinked. Della, our waitress, 20 years old and refilling coffee 2 booths over, froze mid-pour like someone had hit pause on the whole diner. And Poppy, my daughter, 6 years old, gap-toothed, syrup-chinned, looked up from her pancake lake with an expression of pure, delighted shock, like Christmas had arrived 4 months early. But it was Ivy's face I couldn't look away from. She turned toward me slowly, and the color that rose in her cheeks wasn't embarrassment. Not exactly. It was something deeper than that. Something that looked almost like relief, cracking open into disbelief. Like a woman who had spent 2 years bracing for a blow that had just, impossibly, arrived as a gift instead. I want you to sit in that silence with me for a second, because it only lasted maybe 3 seconds in real time. But inside it, 100 things happened at once. I thought about taking it back. I thought about laughing it off, saying, just kidding, Harold, don't have a heart attack. I thought about Claire, my late wife, Ivy's sister, the woman whose ghost had been sitting quietly at every meal we'd ever shared since her funeral. And I thought, for one terrible second, that I had just betrayed her memory in front of half the town. And then Ivy reached across the table. She laced her fingers through mine, right there in front of Harold Pruitt and Della and God and everybody. And she leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. And she said the 6 words that would end up rewriting the rest of my life. Don't you dare take it back. I have relived that sentence more times than I can count since then. The way her voice shook on the word dare, like it cost her something to say it out loud. The way her thumb moved once across my knuckles, checking, I think, whether I was really there, whether this was really happening, whether 2 years of silence had actually just broken open in the middle of a Tuesday crowded diner, over a plate of blueberry pancakes. Harold Pruitt, to his credit, had the good sense to look uncomfortable. Since when, he managed, coffee cup hovering halfway to his mouth. A while, Ivy said, still holding my hand, her voice smoother than mine could have managed in that moment. We don't make a big production of it. Poppy, delighted beyond all reason, chose that exact moment to announce to the entire diner, at full volume, the way only a 6-year-old can. Daddy and Aunt Ivy are married. Della nearly dropped the coffee pot. Wait, for real? Since when? She asked, eyes wide, already halfway to crying for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the fact that 20-year-olds working the Sunday shift at small-town diners are, without exception, hopeless romantics. Long story, Ivy said. And under the table, she squeezed my hand hard enough to leave a mark, which I understood, the way you understand your own heartbeat, to mean, say nothing else, not here, not yet. Harold wandered back toward his stool, muttering something about not meaning to speak out of turn, and the diner slowly rearranged itself back into its normal Sunday hum. Forks against plates, the bell over the door, somebody's radio playing low behind the counter. But nothing about that booth felt normal anymore. Nothing about the space between Ivy and me had gone back to what it was 3 minutes earlier. We didn't talk about it in the truck. Picture that drive. The mountains outside Asheville going gold with early autumn. Poppy singing something tuneless and joyful in the back seat, completely unaware that her father had just detonated 2 years of careful, silent restraint in front of the entire town. And the woman beside me, staring out the window with her hand still loosely resting near mine on the console, like neither of us wanted to be the one to move it first. It wasn't until Poppy was down for her nap and the house had gone that particular kind of hushed that only exists on Sunday afternoons that Ivy finally turned to me in the kitchen. She had a dish towel in her hands, twisting it the way she does when she's nervous, and she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not since her sister's funeral, not once in 2 years of grief and toast-cutting and bedtime negotiations. "You can take it back now," she said. "If you want. Nobody's watching." I need you to understand what those words cost her, because Ivy Calder does not ask for things. In 2 years of living in my house, raising my daughter beside me, holding both of us together with nothing but sheer stubborn love, she had never once asked me for anything back. Not gratitude, not attention, not permission to feel whatever it was she'd clearly been feeling in silence, the same silence I'd been drowning in myself. "Do you want me to?" I asked her. She didn't answer right away. She set the towel down very carefully, like it required her full concentration, like the whole kitchen might come apart if she moved too fast. "For 2 years," she said, "people have looked at me like I'm either a saint or a fool. Like I gave up my whole life to babysit my sister's family out of guilt." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the word guilt. "Nobody has ever once looked at me like—" She stopped. "Like what?" I said. "Like I chose this." Her eyes were shining now, that particular brightness that comes right before tears fall, and she was fighting it, the way she fights everything, quietly and alone. "Like I'm choosing you. Like it's not a sacrifice. Like it's just what I want." I want you to sit with that sentence, because I think it's the truest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years. Like it's just what I want. Not duty, not grief, not guilt dressed up as devotion. Just want. Just choice. Just a woman who had quietly rebuilt a broken family out of love, standing in my kitchen, finally admitting she'd wanted more than gratitude, the entire time. "Ivy," I said. "Don't," she said, holding up a hand, her voice shaking now in earnest. "Don't say anything nice unless you mean it completely, because I have spent 2 years being very, very careful, Daniel, and I do not think I can be careful today." I crossed the kitchen. I took her face in both hands, the way I hadn't let myself do since the funeral, when I'd hugged her a beat too long and had to physically make myself let go before anyone noticed. "I mean it," I said. "I fell in love with you somewhere around month 4, when you learned how Poppy likes her toast cut. I have spent every single day since then ashamed of it, because I thought loving you made me a traitor to your sister's memory." Her breath caught. "It doesn't," she whispered. "Then why does it feel like it does?" "Because you've never let yourself ask the question," she said, "of what Claire would actually want. You've only let yourself feel guilty. Those aren't the same thing." I didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. That question, what would Claire want, was going to follow me through everything that came next. Through her parents' front door. Through a dinner table that would nearly break us apart, before it put us back together. But standing in that kitchen, with Ivy's face in my hands and 2 years of silence finally cracking open between us, I did the only thing that made sense. I kissed her, slowly, carefully. Both of us half-braced for the guilt to come crashing through the door behind us. It didn't come. What came instead was quiet. The particular quiet of a held breath, finally, after 2 long years, let go. And it should have ended there. It would have, if my phone hadn't buzzed on the counter 3 minutes later, lighting up with a name that made both of us go still all over again. Rosalind. Claire's mother. Ivy's mother. The woman who had buried her own daughter 2 years ago and now, somehow, already knew. Word travels fast in a town the size of ours, that the man she'd watched grieve her daughter at that very funeral had just called her surviving daughter his wife in the middle of Ruby's diner. The text was 4 words long. We need to talk. Ivy looked at the screen, then up at me, and for the first time since Harold Pruitt had opened his mouth that morning, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of losing the one family she had left, over the one thing she had never let herself want out loud. "What do we do?" she whispered, and I didn't have an answer. Because what was coming next wasn't going to be decided in a kitchen. It was going to be decided at a dinner table, in front of the 2 people who had loved Claire longer than anyone alive. And they were about to ask us both a question neither of us was ready to answer. Is this real, or is this 2 grieving people protecting each other from being alone? We drove to Rosalind and Walt's house that same evening, and I want you to understand something about that drive, because it tells you everything about what was at stake. It's 11 minutes from my house to theirs. I know, because I've made that drive so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. To drop Poppy off for Sunday visits. To pick up casseroles after Claire's funeral. To sit on that same porch and cry with 2 people who had lost a daughter the same week I lost a wife. 11 minutes. That night, it felt like 11 miles of held breath. Ivy sat beside me in the truck, with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. She hadn't said much since the text came in. She'd changed her shirt twice, which she never does, and stood in front of the hallway mirror longer than I'd ever seen her stand in front of anything, like she was trying to find the version of herself that wouldn't disappoint the people waiting for us. "You don't have to defend anything," I told her, my hands tight on the wheel. "We didn't do anything wrong. Tell that to my mother's face when we walk in," she said quietly. "Tell that to the fact that she buried her daughter, and now she's about to watch her daughter's husband hold her other daughter's hand across the dinner table." I didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. There was no clean way to say what we were about to say. There was no sentence that made this simple. Poppy, mercifully, had no idea any of this was happening. She'd been dropped at a friend's house for a sleepover, chattering the whole way there about the caterpillar she'd named Gerald, blissfully unaware that her father and the woman she now called Mama Ivy, without anyone teaching her to, were about to walk into the most important conversation of both their lives. The porch light was on when we pulled up. Rosalind's roses were still blooming along the fence, the ones Claire used to help her prune every October, and for one strange second, I thought about how strange it was that flowers don't know when to stop growing, even after the person who loved them the most is gone. Walt opened the door before we knocked. He's a quiet man, the kind who says maybe 4 sentences a day and makes every single one of them count. And that night, his face gave nothing away. "Come in," he said. "Your mother's got dinner on." The house smelled like pot roast and rosemary, the same smell it always had on Sunday nights, the same smell that used to mean safety and family, and nothing more complicated than that. Now it felt like walking into a courtroom disguised as a dining room. Rosalind was at the stove with her back to us when we walked in, and I watched her shoulders rise and fall once, like she was gathering herself before she turned around. When she finally did, her eyes went straight to our hands. We hadn't planned to be holding hands. It had just happened somewhere between the truck and the front door, the way 2 people reach for each other without deciding to when they're about to walk into something hard together. And something in her face cracked, just slightly, before she smoothed it back into composure. "Sit," she said. "We're not doing this standing up." Dinner started in near total silence. Just forks against plates, the clink of ice in water glasses, the ticking of the clock over the stove that had ticked through every Sunday dinner of my marriage to her daughter. 15 minutes of silence so thick you could have cut it into pieces and served it alongside the pot roast. It was Walt who finally broke it, setting his fork down with a quiet, deliberate click. He looked at both of us for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was steady in a way that made the question hit even harder. "Is this real?" he said. "Or is this you 2 protecting each other from something?" I felt Ivy's hand find mine under the table before she answered. Her fingers were trembling, just slightly, but her voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. "It's real," she said. "It didn't start as anything. It became something because Daniel and I built a family together out of the worst thing that ever happened to us, and somewhere in the rubble, we fell in love. I didn't ask for it. I didn't want it. For a long time, because I thought it made me disloyal to Claire." Her voice caught on her sister's name, the way it always does. 2 years later, and it still catches every single time. "But I'm done being ashamed of it." Rosalind's eyes filled instantly. "Your sister has been gone 2 years, Ivy." "I know exactly how long she's been gone," Ivy said, and her voice, for the first time all night, held steady all the way through. "I know, because I've counted every single day, same as you have. I loved her more than almost anyone on this earth. But she is not here to raise her daughter. I am. Daniel is. And somewhere along the way, that turned into something neither of us planned, and both of us want. I am not replacing Claire, Mom. Nobody could. I'm choosing to stay. On purpose. For the rest of my life, if he'll have me." I want you to sit inside that sentence for a moment, because I think it's the bravest thing I've ever heard someone say out loud. Ivy Calder, who had spent 2 years being careful, being quiet, being the invisible glue holding a broken family together without ever asking for credit, had just told her grieving mother, in the middle of a pot roast dinner, that she had chosen love on purpose, in the wreckage of her sister's death, and she was done apologizing for it. The table went silent again. But this silence was different from the one at Ruby's diner. This silence had weight. It had the feeling of something about to break, but I couldn't tell yet whether it was going to break apart or break open. Rosalind pressed her napkin to her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking now, and for one terrible second I thought we had lost her completely, that this dinner was going to end with a door closing between our families, forever. "I just don't want people to think," she started, her voice cracking. "Let them think what they want," Walt said. His voice was gentle in a way I had never heard from him before. Gentle in the specific way that only comes from a man who has spent 2 years quietly grieving his daughter without ever once making it about himself. "I'd rather my granddaughter grow up in a house with 2 people who love each other than in one where everybody's just performing grief for the neighbors." Rosalind looked at her husband like he'd said something she hadn't expected to hear from him. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And then, slowly, something in her face began to shift. "Claire used to say," Walt continued, quieter now, like he was pulling the memory up from somewhere he didn't visit often, "that if anything ever happened to her, she'd want Poppy raised by someone who loved her the way Ivy did. She said it more than once, actually. Back when Poppy was still a baby. I always thought it was just talk. The kind of thing you say at 2 in the morning when you're up with a newborn and your mind starts wandering to places it shouldn't." The room went very still. "Maybe it wasn't just talk," he said. I watched something break loose in Rosalind's face. Not composure cracking under pressure, but something closer to permission, like a door she'd been holding shut, with both hands finally easing open just a little. "I don't want people to think we didn't love her enough to grieve her properly," Rosalind whispered. "Nobody who knows this family," I said, speaking for the first time in what felt like an hour, "could ever think that. I have grieved Claire every single day for 2 years. I will grieve her for the rest of my life. Loving Ivy doesn't erase that. It doesn't replace her. It just means I didn't die when she did. It means Poppy still gets to grow up with 2 people who love her enough to build something out of the worst thing that ever happened to any of us." Rosalind was crying openly now. The kind of crying that comes when something too heavy to carry alone finally gets set down. She reached across the table and took Ivy's other hand. Ivy sitting there now with one hand in mine and one hand in her mother's, connected to both halves of the family she'd spent 2 years holding together with nothing but love and exhaustion and quiet, unspoken devotion. "Your sister adored you," Rosalind said, her voice breaking on every other word. "If she's watching any of this, and I have to believe she is, Ivy, I have to believe that I don't think she's angry. I think she's relieved." Ivy came undone then. Not the careful, controlled, almost crying she'd been doing all through dinner, but real, full, shoulder-shaking tears. the kind that had clearly been waiting 2 years for someone to give her permission to let them out. I put my arm around her, and her mother held her other hand, and for the first time since Claire's funeral, I felt something in that house that I hadn't felt in 2 years. It felt like a family, not a broken one held together by grief and obligation. A real one, stitched back together on purpose, choosing each other in the daylight instead of just surviving each other in the dark. But grief, I've learned, doesn't release its grip that easily. Not even on a night like that one. Because it was Rosalind, still holding Ivy's hand, still wiping her eyes with the corner of her napkin, who asked the question that would follow us through everything that came next. "Does Poppy know?" she asked. "Does she understand what any of this means? That the woman she calls Mama Ivy might actually become that, permanently, legally, in every way that matters?" Ivy and I looked at each other, because the truth was, we didn't know. We hadn't talked about it. Everything that had happened that day, the diner, the kitchen, the 6 words that changed everything, had happened so fast that we hadn't had a single moment to think about what came next for the one person this decision would affect more than anyone else alive. "She's 6, I said slowly. "She's been calling Ivy Mama for months, without either of us teaching her to. I think she understood before we did. But has she asked?" Rosalind pressed. "What happens if it doesn't work? What happens to a 6-year-old who has already lost one mother? If this, whatever this is between the two of you, falls apart?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, because it was the one question neither Ivy nor I had let ourselves ask out loud. We had been so consumed by our own guilt, our own fear of betraying Claire's memory, our own careful 2-year silence finally breaking open, that we hadn't stopped to think about the person whose entire sense of safety depended on us getting this right. "We won't let it fall apart," Ivy said, but her voice wavered on the last word. Just slightly, just enough that I heard the fear underneath it. "You don't know that," Rosalind said, not unkindly, but firmly, the way a mother speaks when she's trying to protect 2 people from their own hopeful blindness. "Nobody knows that. I watched my daughter fall in love with your father 35 years ago, believing it would last forever. And I believed it too. And then she got sick anyway, and none of us could stop it. Love doesn't protect you from loss. It just makes the loss worse when it comes." I felt something cold move through my chest. Because she wasn't wrong. Grief had taught me that much already. That love is never a guarantee. That the people we build our whole lives around can be taken from us without warning, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "So what do we do?" I asked. "Not fall in love because it might not work out? Not build something real because Poppy's already lost enough?" "No," Rosalind said, shaking her head slowly. "That's not what I'm saying, Daniel. I'm saying if you do this, if you really do this, both of you, you do it with your eyes open. You do it knowing exactly what it will cost that little girl if it doesn't hold. You do it slowly and carefully, and you make absolutely sure, before you tell her anything permanent, that this is real enough to survive the hard days. Not just the diner, not just the moment it feels easy, the hard days." Ivy squeezed my hand under the table, and I understood, without either of us saying it out loud, that we had just been given something more valuable than approval. We had been given a warning wrapped in love, the kind only a mother who has already lost one daughter to something she couldn't control would think. "We hear you," Ivy said quietly. "We'll be careful. But Mom, I need you to know something. I'm not doing this because I'm scared of being alone. I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for Daniel, or because Poppy needs a mother, or because it's convenient. I'm doing this because somewhere in the middle of the worst 2 years of my life, I fell in love with a good man raising his daughter through unbearable grief, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending I didn't." Rosalind studied her daughter's face for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, "then we go slowly. Together, all of us." We left that house a little after 9 that night, and I remember standing on the porch for a moment before we got back in the truck, looking up at a sky just beginning to fill with stars, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in 2 years. Not relief exactly, not happiness exactly, but something closer to permission. Permission to want something. Permission to build something new out of something broken, without it being a betrayal of everything that came before. But permission from Rosalind and Walt was only half the mountain. Because 2 days later, standing at the counter making Poppy's lunch, cutting her toast into careful triangles the way Ivy had taught me, I heard a small voice behind me ask a question that would test everything we'd just promised her grandmother we'd handle carefully. "Daddy," Poppy said, tugging at my sleeve, her face serious, in the specific way 6-year-olds get serious, right before they ask something that matters more than anything else in the world to them. "If you and Mama Ivy get married for real, does that mean I'm not sad about Mommy anymore? Or can I still be sad and happy at the same time?" I set down the knife. I knelt down to her level, the way I'd learned to do over 2 years of hard conversations, and I looked at my daughter's face, Claire's eyes, my stubborn chin, 6 years old and already asking the kind of question most adults spend a lifetime avoiding. And I realized, kneeling there on our kitchen floor, that the real test of everything Ivy and I had promised her mother wasn't going to happen at a dinner table or in front of Harold Pruitt at Ruby's Diner. It was going to happen right here, in this kitchen, with this little girl waiting for an answer neither Ivy nor I had figured out yet how to give. I knelt there on the kitchen floor for a long moment before I answered her, because I understood, even at 6 years old, that Poppy was asking me the most important question of her entire life, and I was not going to waste it on a rushed answer, just to make the moment feel less heavy. "You can be both," I told her. "You can miss Mommy every single day for the rest of your life, and you can also be happy about Mama Ivy, and neither one makes the other one less true. Your heart isn't a cup that only holds one thing, sweetheart. It's not like a lunchbox where if you put in a new sandwich, the old one has to come out. Your heart can hold your Mommy and your Mama Ivy at the exact same time, both the sad and the happy, forever." Poppy considered this with the enormous seriousness only a child can bring to a question that big. "So I can still love Mommy the same amount," she said slowly, working it out loud. "Even though I love Mama Ivy too." "Exactly the same amount," I said. "Loving somebody new doesn't use up the love you have for somebody else. It just means your heart got bigger to make room." She nodded once, satisfied in the way children are when an answer finally clicks into place, and then she picked her toast back up and asked if she could have chocolate milk instead of regular. And just like that, the enormous conversation was over. Filed away in the effortless way children file away things that adults spend years working through. But it wasn't over for me. Because kneeling on that kitchen floor, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand in 2 years of grief and guilt and silence. Love isn't a betrayal of what came before it. It's proof that what came before it mattered enough to teach you how to do it again. The months that followed were slow, exactly the way Rosalind had asked us to be. We didn't rush anything. We let it be ordinary and true. Sunday dinners at Rosalind and Walt's that got warmer every week. School pickups, bedtime negotiations that Ivy now handled like she'd been born to it, and Poppy calling her Mama Ivy without anyone ever needing to correct or explain it, like the word had simply always belonged to her. We kept going to Ruby's Diner every Sunday. Same booth by the window. Della, our waitress, made it her personal mission to give us extra pancakes for the almost newlyweds, despite Ivy's repeated insistence that we still weren't, technically, anything official yet. Harold Pruitt, to everyone's surprise, became something like an unofficial cheerleader, raising his coffee mug at us every week, like a man determined to make up for what he'd said that first Sunday. That changed on a bright morning the following spring, almost exactly a year after the day I'd called her my wife by accident. We were in our booth. Poppy, 7 now, was narrating an elaborate saga involving her pancakes and an ant she'd rescued from the parking lot. Ivy was laughing at something, hair falling into her face the way it always did, and I found myself doing what I did most Sundays now, just watching her, still faintly disbelieving that I got to. I reached into my jacket pocket, where I'd been carrying a small velvet box for 9 days, waiting for a moment that felt right instead of planned. "Ivy," she looked over, still smiling from whatever Poppy had said. "What?" I slid out of the booth and knelt on the same cracked red tile floor where Harold Pruitt had once told her she was wasting her life, in the same diner where I'd called her my wife before I'd earned the right to. Della, refilling coffee 3 booths down, froze mid-pour. "A year ago," I said, "I called you my wife by accident, and you told me not to take it back." "I never did," I don't want to take it back for the rest of my life. Will you marry me? For real this time? Ivy's hands flew to her mouth. Poppy, delighted beyond all reason, started clapping before her Mama Ivy had even answered, chanting, say yes, around a mouthful of pancake. Yes, Ivy said, laughing and crying at once, the exact way her sister used to when she was overwhelmed with joy, which should have hurt, and instead felt like a blessing passed down instead of a wound reopened. Yes, obviously, Daniel, yes. The whole diner clapped. Harold Pruitt, 3 stools down, raised his coffee mug in a solemn toast. Della cried so hard she had to hand the coffee pot to another server. We got married that September, in Rosalind and Walt's backyard, under the maple tree Claire used to climb as a girl. Poppy was the flower girl, scattering petals with the ferocious concentration of someone completing the most important job of her life. Rosalind cried through the entire ceremony and blamed it, unconvincingly, on allergies. Walt gave a toast that made the whole yard go quiet, about how love doesn't always arrive on schedule, and sometimes the truest kind grows in the middle of the worst thing that ever happened to you, and you don't get to choose when grief turns into grace. You only get to choose whether you let it. When Ivy reached me at the end of the aisle, she took both my hands and said, soft enough that only I could hear it, don't you dare take it back. I smiled so hard it ached. Never, I said. Not this time, not ever. And when I called her my wife again that day, in front of everyone who loved us, it wasn't a slip, or a shield, or a dare thrown out over pancakes to shut a nosy old man up. It was just true. The truest thing I'd said in years, and this time, nobody in that backyard needed convincing at all. Somewhere in that crowd, I know Claire was there too. Not in some easy, sentimental way, but in the real way. In the shape of her daughter's laugh, in the roses her mother still grows every spring, in the fact that the sister she loved most in the world had built something beautiful out of the worst thing that ever happened to any of us, and had done it without ever once forgetting who taught her how to love that hard in the first place. If you've made it this far, I want to leave you with the same question that took me 2 years, 1 accidental confession, and a dinner table full of grief, to finally answer honestly. Is it possible to love someone new without betraying the love you lost? Or does moving forward always mean leaving a piece of the person you loved behind?